Okay, the past Wednesday will be the world map, and that I showed you on the screen last Wednesday. That should be really, really easy for most of you. Anyway, now in the other class, a bunch of those people were asking me, hey, why can't you give out study guides? Look, what I write on the board is the best study guide I could give. After 2 tests, most of you should know that. All right. All right, I'm willing to take the papers that are due today. More than about half of you have already turned them in. I imagine that attendance is going to be really slack today, owing to a threat of bad weather and owing to the fact that it's President's Day and so many businesses and schools in the area are canceled. But this school did not call off, folk. I mean, I checked and I checked email and I checked the school's webpage and I checked WSB. I'm here. All right, so we'll make the most of it. We talked about Sparta on Wednesday. As far as Sparta, today it's Athens. We will spend more time on Athens. To Western Europeans, Athens is far more important than Sparta. Sparta represents a side of European history that has to do with absolute rule, almost tyranny of a sort. Athens has more to do with democracy and freedom, of which Europe is best known for. Not that the democracy always worked. Now, something I want to call your attention to that is also characteristic of European history, more so than the history of other parts of the world, that word reform. In many places in the world, reform is basically unknown or is taboo. In other words, we got it right the first time. We don't need to change. And I'll get a little bit bold and call out a name. Particularly, this is true in the Islamic world, where there have been attempts. There was a man 100 years ago called the Martin Luther of Islam who made attempts to reform. Most of you probably know who I'm talking about when I talk about Martin Luther, I guess. He was a reformer. But he could not reform the Islamic world. What's that? No, it's not about. It was 100 years ago, way back. Yeah, way back, quite a while ago. There was a man who saw that Islam had problems with the rest of the world, getting on with the rest of the world, and tried to reform. But in the case of Europeans, you will find abuses as you study European history. But I challenge any of you to find an abuse that was not followed by a call for reform. Yes, the taking of millions of people out of Africa and enslaving them was an abuse, but there were calls for reform that eventually led to reform. You can find abuses aplenty, but there's always a call for change, for reform. And this is something that you don't find in other parts of the world. I mean, in India, where they have a caste of untouchables, the calls for reform came from outside of India when the Europeans arrived. The people of India accepted this as being a part of the norm. The idea that the wife should throw herself in a fire and burn herself to death when her husband dies, this was a practice in India. Nobody in India ever called for reform, but Europeans said this practice should be outlawed. Europeans are known for having movements for reform. And if you take second semester world history, you'll start off probably with an area of time called the Reformation, where that Europe did a lot of reforming, both Protestant and Catholic. Now, back to the time period that we're talking about, Solon. Hard times were falling on Athens. And Athens has had the best of the land that Greece had, but nevertheless, their farmers fell on hard times and oftentimes would sell themselves into slavery to pay their debts. They get deeper and deeper into debt, and folk, this is a pitfall that a lot of us will go through in our lifetime, deeper and deeper into debt. And to pay their debts, they would sell themselves as slaves, or sometimes sell their sons or daughters as slaves to pay off their debts. Some people said, hey, this isn't right. There needs to be a call for reform. So they called on a man named Solon. If you look into more detail, you'll find that several of these men, including Solon, Plato, Pythagoras, and possibly Socrates, all went to Egypt to get some of their ideas about running the government, or their ideas about science and trigonometry, geometry, from the Egyptians. Anyway, Solon came back from Egypt with some ideas. One of the things he did was outlaw humans as collateral. Now, by collateral, that means the promise that if I can't pay this debt, I will sell myself as your slave. Solon outlawed the practice. However, there was another problem, and this has occurred down throughout history, many a time over. The rich were grabbing up all the lands, and the poor were finding themselves having to sell their lands to the rich. A lot of persons said to Solon, hey, we want you to take these lands back from the rich and redistribute them among the poor. Wisely, I think wisely anyway, Solon refused to do this. Now, folks, we're going to be talking about this from time to time throughout the rest of the semester. There have been many moves. Yes? He refused to redistribute your lands. Now, you might think, hey, why? Wouldn't this have been a wise thing to do? Folk, every time it's been done, it has not worked. It leads to the poor people becoming even poorer still. Basically, it's socialism, pure and simply, where you take the excess money that you say the rich students does not need and give this excess money to the poor. Equal distribution. Now, it sounds great. And I challenge anyone to find an instance where it has actually worked. The rich might be snakes, folk, but I attended a snake show one time where this man said, yeah, I have a pet snake in my house. I also have a dog. He said, as much as we hate snakes, when we've run over them all with our automobiles or killed them with our hose and they're all gone, we're going to miss them. We don't realize how much good they are doing to us until they're all gone. How much good do the rich do? Put it this way, the richer the rich get, the richer I'll get. The richer you all get. Let them get rich. They'll wind up spending some of their money, or they'll wind up hiring you. Again, the richer they get, the richer I get. Don't try to take their money from them by legislative means and redistribute it. It simply will impoverish. Solon seemed to be wise enough to know that. His reforms did not satisfy everybody. Make a long story short, The poor didn't like it because he didn't redistribute the lands. The rich didn't like it because he outlawed human collateral. Now, he was popular with some people, but not with everybody. And finally, Solon was criticized so much, he got a little bit old and said, I'm going to retire. When he retired, the thing he did not want to happen did happen. A tyrant took over. One man stepped into the vacuum named Pisistratus. Now, I'll say this about Pisistratus. Yes, he goes down in history as a tyrant, but generally he's looked on as being a good tyrant. Not evil, like a lot of tyrants. So the Greeks had tried to outlaw tyranny. But nevertheless, he took over and he ran the country as a one-man ruler. And it worked pretty well for a while. When he died, he passed the government on to his son. His son lasted a few months, and the people rose up and said, he is not capable of running the show. So they got rid of him. Into this scenario stepped Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes knew the people did not want another tyrant. So he said, we're going to govern by the Council of 500. Now, this Council of 500 was to last until the Macedonians finally conquered Athens, and actually lasted up until the Romans conquered. It was to last for a long time. The Council of 500 has gotten a bad name because they condemned Socrates to death, and yes, we will talk about Socrates more, but this was 500 men, and I have to say men folk because it was. The Greeks did not generally believe that women were capable of running a government. Now, there were some philosophers who said otherwise. One of them, Plato. But Council of 500 was set up, and they were the governing body who made the laws and decided the issues. And they were like the courts, they decided who would live and who would die. Now, he also set up 10 tribes to try to break up old tribal loyalty. Now, the word tribe, like the word nation, means people related by birth, except tribe is usually smaller than a nation. When you think of tribes, you might think of uncivilized people. In the case of Athenians, they would unite according to families. In other words, if your great-great-great-great-grandfather was a certain man, well, you'd be in this tribe. And for those people, if their great-great-great-grandfather was a different man, it'd be another tribe. But they joined together based on genealogy, based on family ties. Well, Cleisthenes said, no, we're not going to base on family ties. I'm going to redistribute every one of you Athenians in 10 tribes based on a lottery. The idea was to break up old family loyalties that was difficult to break up. So he cast lots, and a lot fell on everybody. I mean, everybody was assigned to 10 tribes. The 10 tribes are equal in size, equal in political power. And the Council of 500 also chosen by lottery. If a lot fell on you, you remember the council. And that way you could not boast, hey, I won an election. No, you were chosen by lottery. Similar to the tribes, you got to be in a certain tribe by lottery. And this was, again, designed to divide up the power and yet make sure that one group did not develop too much power by splitting it up into smaller factions. Now, I'll do as your book does. Your book digresses from Cleisthenes a little bit to talk about some of the things that was going on in Greek culture at the time. Something I have not mentioned, folk, about the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet only had consonants. Well, the Greeks took the Phoenician alphabet with its consonants and added 5 vowels to it and made the alphabet that is much more resembling the alphabet we use today. Now, even though I must say the alphabet we use today is actually the Latin alphabet, which was a copy of the Greek. So the Latin alphabet has 26 letters, of which 5 are vowels, sometimes W and Y, and the rest of your letters are consonants. Again, the original Phoenician alphabet did not have any vowel sounds. The Greeks threw that in, and therefore their writing is much closer to the writing we have today. The Greeks also began to fan out from Greece and spread into what is today Turkey. Your book calls it Asia Minor. Asia Minor, the word Turkey was not used until the 1300s when the Turks came in from Central Asia. So it's called it. The Greeks fanned out and spread into Asia Minor. And this was to lead to the next war that we're about to talk about. So we interrupt our narrative about the growth of Athenian democracy to talk about another situation that developed that all the Greeks had to more or less unite to deal with, and that was the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire expanded and conquered much of the eastern Mediterranean. They had conquered Egypt, and they had conquered Asia Minor. Well, a lot of the Greeks did not like the idea of Persians ruling over them. So they began to undermine Persian authority, and they got help from mainland Greece. The mainland Greeks would send them weapons and money, encouraging them to undermine Persian authority. The kings of Persia decided, hey, we have to deal with this. So, the Persian king began to, there were two Persian kings involved. King Darius was first, and after him Xerxes. They fought against the Greeks twice. First, King Darius came with his army. And to make a long story short, Darius lost. Anyway, the famous battle that Darius fought was the Battle of Thermopylae. Wait a minute, I've got to be careful, folks, that I don't get these mixed up. No, wrong. Marathon. Battle of Marathon. Okay, I sometimes get these mixed up. There's two kings, King Darius, King Xerxes. In the case of Darius, he fought the Battle of Marathon, and he lost. Now, the Greeks held the Olympic Games every 4 years, and one of their winners was a runner named Thucydides. Thucydides was the fastest runner in all of Greece. And when the Persians arrived, it was up to Thucydides to run 150 miles to go to all the Persian cities and tell the Greeks go to all the Greek cities and tell the Greeks that the Persians had arrived. So he was the one who went around warning the Greeks that the Persians were on their soil, got the Greek city-states to send their troops, or young men, to fight. They fought at the Marathon, and yes, Thucydides participated in the battle. You might think, shouldn't they have given him a rest? Well, after the battle was over, they asked him to run the 26 miles from Marathon to Athens. So he ran the 26 miles from Marathon to Athens, got all the way to Athens Square, and he said, "Victory is ours." He collapsed and fell down dead. From that time forward, we still today run a long race called the Marathon to commemorate the event. The Marathon is 26 miles long. So this is how the Greek influence still influences us today. Of course, hopefully our runners are a lot more well-rested. But, and again, they were so much into their military that they would not give a man a rest, even someone like Thucydides, who really deserved it after going 150 miles to warn the Greeks the Persians had arrived. Seemed like they could have given him a rest. And that told me he didn't have to participate in the battle. But again, they felt like if they exempted anyone, if somebody else could come with an excuse why he should be exempted also. Make a long story short, no one was exempted, including Euripides. Anyway, Darius went home in defeat. Darius passed the throne on to his son Xerxes. Xerxes came with an even bigger army. And the Persians and Greeks met each other at the pass of Thermopylae. Now, the Thermopylae Pass was an area between two tall mountains with these tall cliffs on each side where there was no room for flanking maneuvers. And 300 Spartan troops stood in the way of Xerxes' advance, and these 300 Spartan troops stood shoulder to shoulder with shields up like hoplites would, and they told King Xerxes, "We're not going to let you through." Xerxes said, "I'm going to send enough arrows to blot out the light of the sun," and supposedly the Spartans said, "Well, wonderful, we'll just fight you in the shade." There's been a movie made of this event. All 300 of the Spartans wound up dying when a Greek traitor, that is, someone who has betrayed the Greeks, who was a Greek, but the Greek traitor showed the Persians a way around the pass, and the Spartans found themselves with Persians in front of them and behind them, and the 300 Spartans, brave though they were, could not stand up to having these men in front and behind them. So their 300 men was wiped out. However, the Greeks were excellent sailors, much more so than the Persians. The Greek sailors met the Persians at the Battle of Salamis. By the way, about this Battle of Thermopylae, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, there was a movie made about it called 300. Did anybody happen to see it? I see a few heads nodding. Okay, several of you apparently saw it. Anyway, they went from Thermopylae to Salamis. Now, folk, there's a story that a Greek philosopher stood with a concave mirror, and maybe some of you as kids played with magnifying glasses, where you'd shine a magnifying glass, point a magnifying glass at a leaf, and either burn a leaf or dried up leaf or burn a piece of paper with a magnifying glass. I did that when I was a kid. But supposedly he had a concave mirror that would do the same thing, except he shone the concave mirror on the Persian ships and set a bunch of Persian ships on fire. Now today we've tried that experiment, sitting in the same place there at Athens, same time of year that the battle would have occurred, and tried to set wood on fire, the wooden boat on fire with concave mirror. We've tried it with several concave mirrors, several types of wood, and we can't do it. Nevertheless, supposedly they did. Whatever could be the situation, the Greek sailors outmaneuvered these Persian sailors, with the result that the Greeks won the Battle of Salamis and the Persians went home to stay. Now, keep the Persians in mind, though, because the Greeks are to wind up eventually, led by the Macedonians, there to go and conquer the Persian Empire. But that's to come a little bit later. Well, with the Persians gone, the Greeks were able to resume their democracy. And this takes us up to one of the greatest Greek statesmen of all time, Pericles. Pericles was to rule Athens for some 30 years. And under him, Athens was beautified and built. They expected, all right, here's how Pericles was able to beautify Athens. They expected that Persia was to come back. So Athens formed a league called the Delian League. In the meantime, the Spartans said, no, we should be in charge. We're the best, we're the greatest. So they formed another league called the Peloponnesian League. If the Persians had been smart, they should have attacked while these two leagues were fighting each other, but they didn't. Anyway, now, the Athenians told the members of the delegation, "You pay taxes to us and we'll defend you if Persia attacks." Well, the Greeks took this tax money and they beautified Athens. They built the Parthenon and the Acropolis, Mars Hill, and all kinds of other public works, aqueducts, marketplaces, temples, and they greatly beautified their city at the expense. And then when some of the other city-states said, well, there's no threat from Persia, we're going to pull out of the league, the Athenians said, no, you're in, and once in, you're staying. It's like in the United States when the states joined a union. Some of the states, including Georgia, decided we don't want to be in the union, we want to leave. And a big war was fought. And some states were pinned to the union by bayonets, you might say. Anyway, so the Delian League remained intact, so did the Peloponnesian League. Now, democracy became the rule while Pericles was governing Athens. Pericles was able to win 29 out of 30 elections. They held elections every year. And he became the undisputed leader then of Athens. And in fact, your chapter opens up with Pericles giving a speech telling about how great, how wonderful democracy was. Well, more and more Athenians were given the right to vote. I mean, at one time, folk, during this rule of some of these leaders, only the wealthier Athenians could vote, but Pericles made the whole place more and more democratic by giving Athenian men the right to vote until practically every Athenian male had the right to vote. Now, I have to say men, folk, because, again, the Greeks had the attitude that women should not participate in the government. Plato believed otherwise, but he was not in charge. Well, you have two systems here. And I said this before, I'll say it again. They remind me a lot of, led by Sparta. They remind me a lot of the Cold War that I grew up with when I was a kid. This league led by Athens. Athens being like the United States, Sparta being like the Soviet Union. And when they went to war, of course, I'll tell you right now the outcome. Sparta initially won. I have to say initially. Today, Sparta does not even exist except a bunch of stone rubble, stone heaps. Athens has at least 2 million people last time I checked. All right. One little story that's not in the book, but I'll tell it. It was told by my 6th grade history book. There was a time when Athens decided they were going to build walls. Sparta protested and said, hey, you're going to upset the balance of power. And balance of power was a big part of European politics, particularly in the 1800s. Balance of power kept Europe at peace for many years. And you still will hear something about it. Anyway, Sparta said, this will make you too powerful. You upset the balance. So Pericles said to the Spartan ambassador, perhaps you're right. I'll tell you what, I'll go down and talk to your government about it. So Pericles left Athens to go down to Sparta to talk things over. But before he left, he whispered to his top advisors, and I want you to work day and night, build the wall, day and night, while I pretend that I'm negotiating. When you get the wall finished, come and get me. So the Athenians were building the wall day and night, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, putting up the wall and working in shifts. It only took them 2 weeks to put a wall around the city. In the meantime, Pericles pretended to be listening to the Spartans, negotiating with them, halfway agreeing with them, delaying them from coming to a final decision. Then finally someone came up to Pericles from Athens and said, "Hey, sir, the wall is finished." Pericles said bye-bye to the Spartans and went back to Athens. The Spartans were upset, very much so to say the least. But nevertheless, Athens had its wall. Now, the tension between the two of them became so great that eventually it led to the war called the Peloponnesian War. When the Spartans' ambassadors went to talk things over with the Athenians, the Spartan ambassadors said, as they left, said, "You're going to regret this. This is going to go down as a sad day in Athens history." And they spoke very truly. But before we get into more detail, Peloponnesian War, Athens was relying on its navy. Sparta had no navy. Sparta, being landlocked, had no navy, and Athens believed its navy would win. The Spartan soldiers, of course, were super highly trained. But the Athenians felt like they outnumbered them. But the first year of the war was inconclusive. Athens had won a battle or two. Sparta had won a battle or two. They had traded blows. And at the end of the first year, when the war was a seasonal event, like baseball. They only fought the war in the summer. Then in the wintertime, they all went home, rested a while, regrouped for the next season of war. During the winter, Pericles made his famous speech about how great democracy is that you'll read about at the beginning of the first part of the chapter. Then came the second year of the war. The Spartans came and laid siege to the city of Athens, forcing the Athenians inside their walls. And then, as luck would have it, and folk, this has been the scourge of history, a big plague broke out inside the city of Athens. Somehow the plague did not affect the Spartan troops. The Spartans and Athenians were kept away from each other. But the Athenians, keep in mind, 90% of the Athenians lived out in the countryside and were farmers. When the war broke out, these Athenian farmers had to hurry inside the Athens walls. And that meant that a lot of them were living under filthy conditions and overcrowded, just right for a big plague to come in. Well, a plague came and wiped out a huge part of the Athenian population and eventually took away Pericles himself and left Athens without some of its better leaders. Also, Athens was betrayed by some other leaders. Now again, there have been many books written about the Peloponnesian War. We could go into a lot more detail. But the war began going really badly for Athens. And from that point on, the next 19 years, the war lasted 20 years altogether. And it ended with a complete defeat for Athens. I want to give a little aside here. This is not in the book, but about Pericles. Pericles had two sons. And also in his younger days, he had an illegitimate son. Again, all of you, I think, know the difference. Legitimate children are children born to a lawful wedded union. Illegitimate children are children born to a non-lawful union. Well, Pericles had an illegitimate son. Well, as people were dying, including the aristocrats, a lot of men found their sons dead. Except for their legitimate sons dead. So they said, we must make a law that illegitimate sons can inherit the estate. Pericles stood staunch and steadfast and firm and said, no, illegitimate sons should never inherit the estate. Only legitimate sons must inherit an estate. Well, Pericles' oldest son died of the plague. Then his second son died. At the funeral of his second son, Pericles, who believed it, and folk, I'm in no way advocating this, I don't believe it, but Pericles believed that a man should not cry and should not show emotion. Pericles just broke down and sobbed uncontrollably as he watched his second son being buried, completely lost control of his emotions. I'm not saying this was wrong, but he felt he had felt before like this was not the thing to do. Anyway, all he had left was an illegitimate son. So all of a sudden he reversed himself, went before the Council of 500, begging the Council of 500 to pass a law to make it legal for illegitimate sons to inherit the estate. The council refused, just like they had before. Shortly after that, Pericles himself caught the plague and he died. I don't know what happened to his estates, but it apparently did not stay in the family or went to a distant relative or whatever, but not to his sons. Left Athens somewhat leaderless. Athens did make some attempts to recovery. Again, if you look at it more in more detail, they went to Syracuse, located over in Italy. And there Athens lost very, very badly to the people of Syracuse. And the Athenian army was sold into slavery. Eventually, Athens had to surrender. Sparta ordered that Athens' navy be disbanded. The walls were torn down. And Athens was left destitute. Well, Sparta believed that at this point they could take over and rule all of Greece. They might have done it, except for the few things that went against them. They had a big population decline. But before we get to what happened next, we'll turn to a little bit about Greek culture. Greek culture, Greek philosophy. Again, I'm following along the book, and for those of you following with me, I'm looking at page 104. Herodotus. Herodotus is known as the father of history. He wrote history different from anyone else. He started off beginning and tried to write the history of the world. He wrote, his writings include the history of the Persian Empire, even though he was not Persian. He wrote about the Persian Empire and its history and its kings, and without his writings we would not know who was king of Persia and who wasn't, because the Persian writings, a lot of them have not survived. He even wrote about the history of Israel and wrote about some of the kings that are mentioned in the Bible, and he mentioned the Assyrians invading Jerusalem, and he said that rats ate their bowstrings. Others say a plague hit. The Bible says an angel came down and smote the Assyrian army. Believe what you will, but Herodotus mentions that. It said, of course, when rats ate the bowstrings, the Assyrians had to leave because they couldn't fight without their bows. Now, he is called the father of history because he's the first person we know of, other than the Hebrews, who wrote a history of the whole world from its beginnings as far as he knew them up to his present time. But he also did something else. In his writings, he left out a whole lot of supernatural events that other writers, but he didn't leave them all out. There were some supernatural events that he believed in, but modern historians like him because stories of giants, stories of dragons, he tended to leave them out. Stories about the Iliad and Odysseys and one-eyed Cyclopses, he tended to leave those stories out of his history and write a history that is more in line with what modern scholars would call history. That left out a lot of references to the supernatural. Thucydides, who came after him, I'm not going to write that name down, but Thucydides left out even more stuff, more supernatural. So, you have two historians here. Actually, your book says that Herodotus did put a lot of divine stuff in his, divine forces in his stories, and stories about gods. Thucydides left more of that out than Herodotus did. All right, moving on from the writing of history to Greek drama. A lot of Greek drama is in tragedy. You know, a tragedy is a story where the hero dies. Now, have any of you heard your literature teachers or English teachers use the word protagonist? One of you, two of you nodding your head. Protagonist is the main character of a story. Here is the main character. I remember as a kid watching Western shows, and your protagonist almost never got hurt. Protagonist never died. Well, in Greek tragedies, the protagonist would die at the end of the story, and oftentimes he died because the gods willed it. Fatalism. In other words, the gods had foretold something. I've mentioned a story about Achilles, where the gods foretold that he was going to die in battle. And in spite of all of his mother's attempts to prevent it, Achilles died in battle. Another famous story is the story of Oedipus. I'm pretty certain that's in the book. Oh yeah, but I don't see it here. I'm looking. Anyway, Oedipus, someone foretold that he was going to kill his father and marry his mother. Well, when he was born, his father put him away, thinking, I've got him put away, he's gone, and he'll never come back. But eventually, Oedipus grew up unknown that his father was the king, and not knowing the king was his father. He wound up killing his father and marrying his mother, all unknowingly. And again, this is because the gods had decreed it, and nothing man could do was able to prevent it from happening. It was what the gods had decreed, no one could undo. Now, oh yeah, it's at the bottom of page 105 in my book. Apollo was the god who foretold that the sun come. In the world of art, Greek art strove for realism. This is something that modern art does not do. Modern art says we have cameras, leave realism to the camera. We don't strive to be realistic. But a Greek artist bragged that he could make a statue of an apple that was so real looking that deer would come up and lick the apple, or lick the statue rather than lick the apple. Or they could paint a picture of an apple, or paint a picture of fruit that was so real that animals would actually come up and try to steal the fruit that they had painted. Realism. They also strove for the ideal. And again, folks, realism was abandoned by artists later as we try to paint surreal. Someone's called surreal or modern art. Some of you might know a lot more about this than I do. But we leave realism for the cameras anymore. Hey, we got cameras that can take care of reality. Now, the Greek art, among other things, they tried to depict what they thought of was the ideal male figure, particularly in regard to the gods. Now, when I was 11 years old, one of my classmates asked me, how come these statues of gods always show them naked? I did not know the answer to that at the time, but the answer is the Greeks believed that their gods had the ideal male body, which the Greeks tried to strive for. A body with broad shoulders and slender waist and huge biceps. This was the ideal. And the Greeks hoped that this was... Now, on the same note, when I was a kid, there were some men who would advertise that we can give you this ideal body. One of these men was Charles Atlas. Some of you probably might have heard of him, but if you read an old comic book, they will have Charles Atlas ads, and they'd show two men. One of them was the before, and the other the after. And you look at these men's faces with a magnifying glass, and I began to suspect that the before and the after were two different men they were depicting. Any of you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
The after was always this muscular He-Man, and the before was either someone who was overly thin or overly fat. But if you look at it, you could not tell if they were the same man or not. And again, they accused him of picking different models for the before. But he claimed, now I can transform you in just 7 weeks from this man, skinny, underweight man here that's pushed around on the beach, to a man who is this He-Man here on the side. And the ideal body supposedly was the Greek, the same as the Greek ideals. And if you look at the Superman comic books, supposedly Superman, Batman, and all these superheroes had the ideal male body, the broad shoulders, the thin waist, the bulging biceps, large legs and whatever. There was a muscle man. Now, I had a student ask me once, who's to say what the ideal body is? All right, now where this became, I mean, again, I'm not saying that in any way that's the ideal body, but they believed it. Now, where this had a really tragic turn to it, the word Superman actually comes from Nietzsche in the 1890s, who set forth the ideal that every man should have the body of a Greek god. And Adolf Hitler then took it up. And he believed he was going to create a race of Supermen. And as much as Superman was my ideal when I was a kid, I have to think that Superman might have actually been a creation of the Nazis to infiltrate us and to try to get the Americans. I mean, the Nazis had tried to infiltrate with their ideas of socialism and idealism and the ideal body to try to get us to eliminate the persons who did not have ideal bodies or who were not of the ideal race, particularly white Aryan race. So then that's Hitler's term, not mine. But the superior race, and everybody else should be eliminated to create the ideal body. And so, folks, this does have some importance and relevance to today. And I have when I went to UT in 1971, my professor was using a 1930s book to teach medieval history. And this book glorified, written in the 1930s, glorified the Germans and the German race and how the Germans put superior blood among the Italians, and eventually the Germans were able to defeat the Italians because they were better than the Romans. I call it Italian, better than the Romans. It was putting German supremacy and German superiority, teaching that to American college students. And this professor was still using this book in 1971 from the 1930s. He was criticized for it, by the way. But the authors were promoting German superiority long after the Nazis had died. But again, back to the Greeks. They were trying to put forth the ideal body, which was the body that supposedly their gods had. Their goddesses, again, supposedly their goddesses had the ideal body that females should try to emulate as much as possible. And folk, I don't in any way mean to put a trip on you. I've heard more than once that a lot of these ideal bodies in today's world are computer enhanced, that they're not real. And if you do happen to get a body like that, you can only keep that figure for a couple of years, and after that it goes. It's not worth destroying yourself over. And again, a lot of young women develop a problem with dietary anorexia. Some of you hopefully don't know what I'm talking about personally, but you might have heard of anorexia nervosa, a disease that can affect men too, an eating disorder that has killed a lot of young women because they're afraid of becoming overweight. All right. Leaving that for the moment and going on to philosophy. Actually, now in art, I mustn't leave art. I mean, in art, the Greeks developed the columns. They held up their temples, and your book shows the Dorium shaft column. I mean, the Dorium column, and other types of column. Don't worry about them, but I just want to mention, I am aware that the Greeks developed these. Their temples, by the way, the Greek temples did not have walls as such. They had a roof, and the roof was held up by the columns. But the wind could blow right through them because there was no wall to keep out the wind. So the temperature inside changed with the temperature outside. Now what this led to, and of course maybe they could not prevent it, but eventually, all of you hopefully know from your physics classes that as things get hot, they expand, as things get cold, they contract. Eventually these statues would, by shrinking and contracting, would eventually develop cracks in them. Then they would start falling apart, and if nobody came in to repair them, eventually the whole temple would crumble. But again, if these temples had walls, they probably could not have prevented the crumbling. Given the 1,000 or more years, any building is going to crumble, whether it's made of stone or made of steel or what we do today is we make our buildings easy to disassemble. Like when this building gets too old to be useful, it can be easily disassembled with our modern machinery, carried off, and a new building put in its place. And we're making our buildings more and more that's easy. I mean, our ceilings, drop ceilings, it's easy to be replaced, easily repaired. And also because we have so many wires and cables and ducts and pipes and tubes going across the ceiling. I mean, again, that suits us in our modern times. In our walls, we have all kinds of wires and going across the wall. The walls are easy to break open and easy to fix once they've been broken open. I mean, if you're an expert. I'll say this, at my house, if you ever visit me, we had to have a repairman repair a leaking gas line. And he had to break part of the wall, but he would not fix the wall, so I tried my hand at it. And I've been working on it off and on for about 3 or 4 months. So somehow I just can't get the wall to look as smooth as I want it to. I've used a sander, I've used pipe filler. But if any of you are experts in this, I mean, I'd like to see it. I want to talk to you. But I just can't get it to line up. But again, spackling compounding, that's what it's not the word. Spackling, filler, trying to get my wall to look as smooth as it. But again, I'm not gifted in that area. But an expert can really do a good job with walls. But if these walls were to start cracking, they're easy to fix. The point I'm making. Same way with those concrete block walls. When they crack, fix them, paint over the crack, and they're repaired, at least temporarily. All right. But the Greek temples did not last to this day. They don't have any functionality and utilitarian. The most famous being the Parthenon. Unfortunately, in the 1600s, they began storing gunpowder in the Parthenon, a dangerous thing to do. The gunpowder got a spark and blew up and destroyed a big part of the Parthenon, and it has never been repaired. The problem with repairing it, folks, is the new part, the new section would look brand new, and the old section would crack and crumble. And how do you repair or restore a stone structure? You just have to take away all the old stone and replace it with all new. It's the only practical way it can be done. All right, leaving that. The Greeks did not always know the difference between philosophy, science, or mathematics. Pythagoras. Known for his working with numbers, he is remembered for a particular theorem. Now, you might not have expected to see this in a history class, but assuming that this is a right angle, if this side is 3, and don't worry about whether it's 3 feet, 3 inches, or 3 yards, whatever, and this side is 4, what's this side going to be? I heard something. 5. Again, 3 squares, the formula is A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Again, I don't know if you expect to see that in a history class, but nevertheless, it's there. It's still used today. A squared, in this case, A is 3 squared equals 9. 4 squared equals 16. 16 and 9 is 25. Hopefully all of you know that 25 is, in fact, a perfect square. The square root of 25 is 5. Pythagoras is remembered for this theorem. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. And again, just like a show of hands, how many of you have run into this in your geometry or math classes? Okay, almost every hand in the room is going up. All right, then you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, it goes back to Pythagoras. Now, I have a book at home that says Pythagoras actually learned this from the Egyptians, who had never forgotten it, who had known it all the way back to the days of the pyramid building. All right, philosophy. More about philosophy. There is an attempt made by some people to explain everything. Albert Einstein spent the last years of his life working on what we call the theory of everything. Well, the sophists did not believe it. The sophists said, oh no, there's some things that are not going to be explained. Now, folk, I have read in recent years that more and more scientists are coming around to the belief that the sophists had. There's some things that just simply cannot be explained, and there are some things that will not be explained. Or if they are explained, they won't be explained within our lifetime. But there are others who believe, no, we're eventually going to get to our science to a point where we will have theories that, or maybe one big unified theory of everything called the TOE, T-O-E theory. It was once called unified field theory, where that we will explain everything. Well, the sophists said we can't understand this, so they rejected it. They said that human minds cannot understand the universe, and Confucius would agree with them. Instead, we should spend our time just trying to better ourselves from where we are. The sophists were also, we cannot. I'll just write, we cannot understand everything. They also were great speech makers, called rhetoric. I want to elaborate here a little bit on this word rhetoric. If you study American history, you'll come to the American Revolution, and there were two men. Both of them were from Virginia, and the two men actually liked each other. One of them named Patrick Henry, the other named Thomas Jefferson. Perhaps you've heard of these men in the American history classes. One of them, though, was full of rhetoric, the other one full of logic. Now, but they both agreed on one thing. They agreed that the King of England must go. But here's what Thomas Jefferson said. And he said, he has abolished our legislatures. He has imposed taxes on us without our consent. He has taken our men far away from us to be tried in a foreign country without our consent. He has abolished our courts without our consent. Now, that's talking now Patrick Henry. Our chains are already forged. You can hear the clanking of our chains on the plains of Boston. Is life so dear, peace so sweet, to be purchased by a price of chains and slavery? I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Which one of those men were full of rhetoric? Patrick Henry, rhetoric. Thomas Jefferson, logic. Rhetoric, the ability to try to persuade people by use of exaggeration. I mean, I have to call it exaggeration, emotion, emotional appeal, exaggeration. The Greeks, but democracy, by the way, leads to a lot of oratory, persuasion. Getting up in front of a crowd and trying to sway the crowd. Getting in front of the Council of 500 and trying to persuade them to pass a certain law. You often resort to exaggeration or to plain old rhetoric. Thomas Jefferson did not believe in rhetoric. Patrick Henry, most of what he talked about was rhetoric. Now, this takes us up to three of the greatest philosophers of all time, at least great as far as getting people to follow them, getting people to talk about them hundreds and even thousands of years later. These three are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And I'm going to put this other man. He was not a philosopher. But I will mention him here. Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. Alexander, of course, was not a philosopher, but he was a king who conquered most of the known world. But anyway, back to Socrates. We'll come to him later. I want to give an overview, though, of all these three men here. They developed a following, and their philosophies were debated and followed for centuries afterward, even into the Christian era. Now, personally, folk, I mean, if you actually read what they believe, if it sounds foolish to us today, it's because these people had a different mindset than we do, and their thought patterns were somewhat different from ours. And you have to understand the world they lived in. It was a world before automobiles, before airplanes, before computers, before cell phones, to say the least. But now, here's this, I mean, hey, I've spent a lot of time studying these men, reading them, researching them on the internet. But as much as it pains me to say so, I must say that I really feel like that these three men, without meaning to, they destroyed everything that they touched. First, they destroyed the Athenian world. They destroyed then the Greek world. Then when the Greeks gave away to the Hellenistic world that Alexander started, they wound up destroying that. Then they got, you might say, they got their hands from the grave. They got their hands on the Roman Empire. And they destroyed that also. Again, this is my take. All right, now to go into more detail about what each of these men taught and believed. Socrates first. We have three original sources of Socrates. One of them Plato, another one Xenophon, another one Thucydides. I'm not going to, except for Plato, I'm not going to write these down. I mean, now again, there have been persons who have spent their entire life studying Socrates. And my professor at UT spent an entire class period talking about Socrates. We don't have that kind of time. And there are persons who offer courses on Socrates and his philosophy. But anyway, we have to be a little more brief. Socrates gave the approach called the question and answer. Now, he questioned everything. He believed that all the knowledge of the universe lay inside every person, and all it would take to get it out was if the right person questioned you. Now, folk, I want to ask you, how many of you know how tightly the cylinder head should be torqued on your automobile engine? I don't know. Now, it is important. It really is. And you know something? Somebody has to know that. If you don't torque these nuts on your cylinder head the right to that even torquing, one nut will get more beating than the other nuts on your cylinder head, and eventually you'll throw your cylinder head right off the top of your cylinder. It's that important. But if you don't know, don't worry about it. You don't have to know it. But no amount of questioning I can give to you will bring it out of you if I keep bugging you about now, how tightly should you torque the nuts on the cylinder head of your automobile engine. Unless you look it up, folks, the answer is not inside your head, and it will not come out. Nevertheless, he had a point. I mean, you know, one reason we give tests is question and answer. You learn a lot from tests. And you are more likely to remember a question you missed. Hey, I missed a question on a test at Lockheed some 30 years ago. The answer was cavitation. And I had an uncle named Calvin, a cousin named Calvin. I thought, that's... But then I could, which uncle was it? Which cousin was it? It's an uncle, a cousin. And I couldn't, the word was cavitation. It had to do with hydraulics. If you don't know what that word means, again, it has to do with where you have air in a hydraulic line, and it can really cause havoc with the hydraulic line. Anyway, leaving that, the word cavitation is also used in rivers flowing, where the river gets really wild and hits the side of a wall pretty hard, and can really, the Grand Canyon was created a lot by cavitation. Again, if you didn't know that before, don't worry about it. But somebody has to know it. Anyway, question and answer method. He would bring it out. Now, he really made a dunce of himself. He would catch people on their way to court. And everybody on his way to court believes, hey, my case is right. And once the judge hears me, well, Socrates would warn him, hey, you may not have the better case. The other fellow over there, he has a better case than you do. Eventually, this was to lead to Socrates' death. Now, he's famous for the quote, know thyself, but some people say that he did not really invent this quote. Other person criticized the quote, saying it's really impossible, none of us do, and you can't. Be that as it may, that can be looked on as being one of the greatest quotes of all time. He also said, among other things, and this is in your book, the unexamined life is not worth living. And okay, I have to concur with him there. If everybody would take time to examine, what am I doing? Where am I going? Is what I'm doing right? Is the way I'm treating a fellow man right? Maybe a lot of our problems might be solved, but again, the problem we have with that is all humans are basically flawed. Well, after Athens had lost the war, Socrates had participated in the Peloponnesian War, and he appeared to be a mighty warrior, brave hero. But after he had participated in the war, the Athenians were simply in no mood to listen to new philosophies. And Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth. That was the charge. Now, being a parent myself, when I was a kid, I just wondered, what is so wrong about corrupting the youth? Then I became a parent, and as a parent, you are so worried, will my children pick up ideas and develop behavior patterns that I don't agree with? Will my children at some point, will they go off and join a cult? Will they go off and become a communist? Or yes, will they go and join a terror group? Whatever. And folk, a lot of parents find it is happening. So the people of Athens are really concerned because they had lost a war, and they were afraid that Socrates was actually on the side of the Spartans. And I want to say this about thinking your leaders are on the other side. When I was a kid, we would accuse our leaders of being communist. Nixon got elected by accusing his opponents of being communist. Then when he got to be president, he was accused of being communist because he made all these overtures to the communist world. And some of our present leaders are accused now of being pro-Muslim. Some of you might be aware of what I'm talking about. But we often accuse our leaders of taking up the other side. Socrates was not a leader, but he was no exception. Now, folk, I got about 5 or 6 minutes. There's another side of Socrates. Now, in my search of Socrates on the web, 3 out of 4 of his admirers will not mention this. But I think it's important. I really, really have to mention it. Socrates claimed to be buddies with a demon. He believed that this demon was whispering things into his ear. Now, I want to say this about, I had a Muslim girl in a class a year ago who said that the Muslims call them genie, but they believe 90 to 95% of the world's people have believed that there are spirit beings floating around that can implant suggestions in people, including Christians. A lot of Christians believe that. Most of your Muslims believe that. Socrates was like the 95% majority. He believed this demon was his good friend. We think of demons as being bad, but this demon was keeping him morally upright. Now, I have time to say this. Now, this subject, if you think I'm afraid of it, you're right. But I'm going to say it anyway. The Greeks were homosexual. Your book is going to mention that. If you've read the chapter, you find that among the Greek aristocracy, male homosexuality was the ideal. Socrates believed it was wrong, but apparently he had the temptation, so he said this demon was keeping him from the young boys, and also the demon was helping keep the young boys away from him. Now, unlike these other 2 men, Socrates married, had 3 sons. We know the names of his sons. And some people believe that his marriage was just he was trying hard to overcome his tendency toward homosexuality, and he might have been successful. Because he believed, the Greek ideal of homosexuality is something that supposedly we still make illegal. It was grown men with young boys. Not 2 grown men in a consensual relationship. The Greeks had no problem with that. The problem was grown men with young boys. And this is in the book, if you've read the book. Socrates believed that his demon was keeping him from the young boys and keeping him morally pure. And that his demon was telling him these truths, these philosophical truths, which he told to the people around him. Anyway, Socrates was eventually accused of corrupting the youth. He was tried before the council. The council, there were two trials, one to determine if he was guilty or not, the other to determine the penalty. The first charge that he was guilty of corrupting youth, the council barely, I've seen the figures, but they barely convicted him. Well, then came the penalty phase of the trial. They could have just simply given him a slap on the wrist or a fine. Instead, Socrates, smart-mouthed, disrespected the council and said, "What right have you to judge me anyway?" So at that point, the council voted overwhelmingly for the death penalty. So when the time came, Socrates some of his friends tried to plot his escape. He refused. He said that would be wrong. When the time came, he drank the hemlock, which was a poison, cheerfully drank the hemlock and died. Now, some people pointed out, though, that Socrates was already 70 years old when he was forced to drink the hemlock, and he himself said, "I don't fear death. I know it's inevitable, and it's either I'm going to become a god or I'm going to become annihilated. I don't know or care which." But he said, "What do I have to look forward to in life?" Well, he said, "I'm already 70 years old, and men who once I could beat in a foot race, they're now beating me." In other words, he was still running foot races at 70. Men who I once could beat in a wrestling match, they're now beating me. And all I have to look forward to is losing my mind, or losing control of my bowel and bladder functions, or losing my ability to walk, or having to walk with a cane." And he said, I don't look forward to any of that. So the best years of my life are behind me. What do I have left? So he cheerfully drank the hemlock and died. He had no sooner died than the Athenians looked around among themselves and said, "Hey, we've killed a philosopher." The Spartans pointed their finger and said, "Naughty, naughty." The Persians pointed their finger, "Naughty, naughty." The other Greek city-states said to the Athenians, "Naughty, you killed a philosopher." And the Athenians have had that on their conscience from that day till this. He became then somewhat of a martyr, as is the case of a lot of men who have died at the hands of he became honored after he died, more so than he was. Well, the same thing could be said for Solon. Solon was honored more at death than he was while alive. Same thing can be said for Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was called an imbecile, an idiot, and everything else while he was alive. Then as soon as his side had won the war, he was assassinated. He was set on a pedestal right next to George Washington. Socrates was honored after he died. All right.